Hello everyone, thanks for being here. I have the pleasure to announce the second session of today on time structures, transdisciplinarity, time regimes and contemporary artistic practices. I'm Fabian Save de la Lada. I'm the director of the medienwerk.nrw office, which is organizing this conference. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Judith Funke, a very dear colleague of mine, who will moderate the session. A very warm welcome to all the panelists as well. They will be introduced by Judith in a couple of minutes. Judith Funke, she's a freelance curator, writer and editor. She's based in Bochum, studied media science and film in Bochum, and has worked for several institutions. We were colleagues at Hardware Medienkunstverein, HMKV. She also worked at International Short Film Festival in Oberhausen and for the Doc Film Festival in Kassel, that's correct. And for the ICEA conference, ICEA 2010 Ruhr, the International Symposium on Electronic Art 2010. And is part of the selection committee for the Doc Film Fest in Kassel since 2012. So, welcome to all of you, and I hand it over to Judith. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fabian. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you all for coming here. I'm very happy to have this very interesting round of people with me to explore what happens when different time regimes and different time experiences of time come together, when boundaries are crossed in between artistic disciplines and also institutional contexts. This is our project for this panel, and we would like to have different perspectives on these questions. First, we will start out with a more theoretical perspective by Kirsten Maar, who will, I will introduce you in a minute, but just to make the round complete, afterwards we will have the curatorial point of view from Laurence Rassel, who's directing the Fundació Antonita Pies in Barcelona. And then we have two artistic positions, two artists here, Manuel Pelmus and Daniel Kötter, who also are very interested in working in between artistic disciplines. Manuel is a choreographer who mainly works in the visual arts fields today, and Daniel Kötter is a film and video director who crosses institutional contexts deliberately, and will tell us more about that in the end of this panel. Before we come to an open discussion, we would like to, as you have noticed, we've changed the space a bit. We would like to have this discussion really open, so feel free to intervene, give me signs, I will try to notice. Now, shortly before Fabian and Klaas first talked to me about this conference and about this panel in particular, I had experience regarding time regimes and a specific experience of time. It's a very trivial experience, but I think it might fit in well because it leads us back to the Stedelijk Museum, which has come up already a few times today and yesterday. I was in the Stedelijk Museum for a temporary exhibition. I spent a lot of time there. I had some time left, about 15-20 minutes, and I had the choice to go to the collection or not. I did it. I wasn't prepared at all. I kind of stumbled in there and knew I had only these few minutes to see this huge collection. So I was walking through, being a bit lost, and came past not the first work of Tino Segal in that exhibition, which we discussed yesterday already, but the second one in the collection of the Stedelijk Museum, entitled "Instead of Allowing Some Time to Rise Up to Your Face, Dancing Bruce and Dan and Other Things." I'm sorry I have to read this, but it escapes my mind. It's an early work from 2000. I didn't know that at the time, I have to admit. And I was a bit stressed, I was watching this person. There's one dancer on the floor rolling in a very slow manner and very introvertedly, not asking me to participate at all, to come back to the panel we just had. And I was really drawn into that time mode. But still, I knew I had my 15 minutes left. So I was really torn between those time modes. And then there was this public announcement from the museum asking me to kindly walk towards the exit. So all of a sudden, I didn't only have my internal pressure of not following this really seductive slowness, but I also had this institutional pressure on me to behave as I'm supposed to. And then a woman came in the room with a bucket of water. And for a split second, I was so curious about what was about to happen. And then I realized that, of course, she was part of the cleaning staff, getting ready to finish, close the space off. So, as I said, this is very trivial, but when preparing for this, I had the impression that a lot of the critiques written on these kinds of artworks are describing these kinds of tiny micro experiences and often being apologetic about the triviality of it. But I think these specific moments and experiences are very interesting to look at. And what we are discussing here, especially when it comes to time, and to discuss how different modes of perception overlay, how different kinds of institutional and societal circumstances overlay once you experiment with different conventions in art. That was a bit too long, I am afraid, so I will straight away hand over to Kirsten Maar, who will give us an overview of practices in the fields of dance and museum mainly, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. Kirsten Maar, Kirsten Maar's research focuses on the intersections between choreography and the visual arts since the 1960s. She has done a PhD on the choreographic work of William Forsythe and its relations to architecture, so they are also crossing a border. And she was a member of the DFG Collaborative Research Center, Aesthetic Experience and the Dissolution of Artistic Limits. She has also published as a co-editor the work Assign and Arrange Methodologies of Presentation in Art and Dance, published in 2014. And she also works in practical projects as a dramaturg. So, Kirsten, please.
Thank you, Judith. And thank you also again for the invitation. To Fabian, thank you, and to Klaas for the wonderful organization and the opportunity to be here in this discussion round and this wonderful program. I start with the dissolution of artistic limits. This was my idea. So, since we have this dissolution of the artistic limits since perhaps the early avant-gardes or since the 60s, and we just discussed in the break that in essentially you could perhaps never have these real boundaries between the arts as perhaps Lessing or Aristotle defined them. So certainly there are these what Lessing called the Raum and the Zeitkunst, so the spatial arts and the time arts, but certainly there are no strict limits in between those practices which are given in certain art forms, but it's challenging to see what's the medium specificity and what happens in the processes of transferal between those different art forms. Is this okay when I stay here? I decided not to go there because I have no images to show. Do you hear me? Okay. And within this dissolution, especially since the 60s, new genres like installation art, like environment, like site-specific work and land art or performance emerged. So, and as well, with the development, the dispositives of exhibition as well as performance were constellated anew. Some artists like Trisha Brown showed their work in the galleries of the visual artists like Robert Morris and Robert Rauschenberg worked as choreographers in the context of the Judson Church, for example. And, well, the museum traditionally is a site of representation or collection or the archive, which helps to constitute also, I think this is also important what you meant with the behavioral aspects, constitute a kind of educational framework with its own rules and codices of behavior assigned by the architecture of the building as well as by the arrangement of the objects and the specific kind of displays. And what does it now mean to constellate this with a kind of which is always described as the most ephemeral art form, this kind of very archival practices of the museum and the ephemerality of dance and choreography. So there are different time regimes. There is a free choice of the beholder how long to pay attention to something, in contrary to the framework of a theater where you have this focused attention for a restricted time frame. But we could discuss this also, how these time framings work. So is it perhaps always, is it a negative thing to have this disseminated attention, to have the choice to wander between different kind of events and to take your own choice? Or what other points are there in this focused attention which you pay for a longer while, which you pay for instance, for 3 hours? And when does your attention then also diminish? So what happens in the intersections and the processes of transfer and of translation from one art form to the other, and how far do curatorial and choreographic practice intersect? What does it mean to choreograph an exhibition? And I mean, you will certainly speak about that, perhaps, I don't know. And vice versa, what does it mean for performance and art to be presented in a museum or gallery context instead of static exhibition objects, which are not so static as I say it here? What happens to the corporeality of the dance, and at which level do their specific skills play a role in this setting? And I guess here I would like to add a critique also of this actual phenomenon that also in this frame of more and more showing dance in the exhibition context, it's also a framework of who is talking about what. So there are more and more art critics and art historians writing about this phenomenon, and writing about it in a specific manner, also deriving from their discipline and having different framings in their viewing about what is dance and how it is framed, and not so much time-wise looking at the aspects of what is movement, or what are the dancely skills. And this might perhaps also differ within different projects, from Xavier Leroy's exhibition, from the project of Xavier Leroy's Musée de la Danse, where he works with also with the dancers and their specific training methods. I remember I had the situation when I went to the Musée de la Danse. Directly when I entered, I had a kind of workshop session about half an hour with Shelley Center, a former Trisha Brown dancer, where she introduced the rules of the movement sequences of her accumulation pieces, which she did in the 70s. And we were talking about all those training skills which are required to obtain these skills. So just as an example. So what are the meta-discourses also in these practices? So another question might be, which artistic and on the other hand, which economic interests are behind those decisions for the institutions on one hand, and for the choreographers to decide to be presented in that context on the other hand, and how do they reflect each other from the side of the museum and from the choreographers? I guess it's certainly not about a kind of musealisierung of dance, but deals with the question of creating specific spaces of experience, as Charlotte Clonk says it, and asks how choreography and dance could also enable those specific experiences. And here I think it would be useful perhaps to clarify the notions of dance and choreography and the differences between. I mean, just to frame it a bit, so choreography comes from the Greek word choros, and referring to the ritualistic round dance as well as to the place where it takes place. So we have this notion of a creation of community on the one hand, and a culture of remembering on the other hand, which go together. We have, on the other hand, we have this notion of choreography, referring to the practice of notation, of scribbling and drawing, which historically and still today is a little bit more relevant in some ideas. And as a prescriptive order and as a conceptual framework, it precedes the dance, which in a traditional body-mind dichotomy is still regarded as secondary. And in my eyes here, there's one of the very major problems in adequately judging also choreography in dance and the hierarchies which go along with it. And here I just shortly come to why perhaps the 60s are also this important in that regard. I mean this aspect when we speak of procedures of what you called with the book you mentioned of assignment and arrangement. So this period of the Dutch Church from 1962 to 1964, or even longer when we see the end with the Grand Union in 1970, seems so important. But we have at the same time the emergence of conceptual art, and we have minimal art, and I won't refer at this moment of all these convergences in that realm, but we have these emerging procedures in composition in music, and we have this use of scores also in the conceptual art and other art forms. And so this becomes fundamentally also for choreographic procedures, chance operations, as well as including of everyday movement, the refusal of virtuosity and Rainer's no to spectacle and theatricality, where this is just now. And so this is perhaps interesting in that question, which effects did this have also on contemporary dance? Why are so many choreographers now looking back to that time? And why all these kind of reenactments referring to those practices in the context of the exhibition especially, I guess. Should I stop here, or should I add some remarks also still on perhaps the economic asset and the...
We have time, yes.
Perhaps this one last point, in her essay, which was written already in 1990, in The Logic of the Late Capitalist Museum, Rosalind Krauss, the art historian, considered the role of the heritage of minimal art again, and its phenomenological experience, serial, and the industrial reproduction, which were against the overestimated value of the original. She diagnosed then a change also in the museum's practice from a diachrone to a synchrone perspective, not anymore relying on the historical and linear transmission of knowledge, but aiming to create spaces of experience, again relying on this phenomenological experience and the so-called body perspective. Paradoxically, she said that the art form which started to undermine the value of the original contributed in a way to the success at the art market, and again to a idea also how important that could be in the logic also of the event of some singular experiences in the museum's context. This shift from transmission of knowledge to experience, as we also say in these big spaces of museums culture, like for example the Tate Turban Hall, when we see these expositions of Eliasson or other artists which have these big immersive spaces. I think there we have a big difference to this logic of exhibiting dance, which is not so much this logic of the event, which seems for me very adequate to this big presentational immersive spaces. But we have here in this presentation of dance in the museum, we have these different practices, this notion of different kinds of transmission of knowledge, as well as the experience. So combining those two aspects, I would suggest. But yeah, perhaps. Yeah, the last thing would perhaps then again the idea to speak of the kinesthetic experience of the beholder or of the audience in those contexts. I guess it's not only the ephemeral nature of a fleeting experience, but what I mentioned before, that in this traditional hierarchy between choreography as the assignment, which then creates also specific spatio-temporal arrangements within a given situation in the museum, created by the dancers and by the beholders at the same time, even if they are not participating. I think in these processes, the practices and techniques are a little bit underestimated. The practices and techniques the dancers bring in, their specific knowledge they have in dealing with what emerged also from the Judson period is this interest in minimal and everyday movement, and from this the interest in techniques emerged again also with the reconstructions of the Judson Church, which started in the early 90s. And since a few years, we have also this renewed interest in body practices, in body-mind centering, in authentic movement, in Feldenkreise. So we have a large range of choreographers who deal with those questions. And I guess it's no coincidence that this happens, because it's really this interest: what is the relation between a conceptual framework, a score, and how do the practices and the techniques influence that? How is this framework between choreography and dance then differently installed, and how could it be performed, and how could it generate these specific experience also for the beholder? Because these practices, rather than a specific form as we know in ballet technique, are perhaps aiming also at creating a kind of a kind of continuum between the dancers and the beholder. And finally, perhaps to frame that, I guess the example you showed also from Mette Ingvardsson before, she wrote that Yes manifesto some years before as a response to Yvonne Rainer's No manifesto, where she claimed for affect, where she claimed for a re-evaluation of virtuosity. And I guess also this is a notion of affect which we had in large discussions the last years, especially also on this way of reception, and how do we frame the spaces of experience for the beholder. I think that might be interesting to discuss perhaps how this is framed, how do these techniques contribute to this, because they refer to a body which is much more than still in a very organicist way. Does one say so? In a ganzheitliche, in a holistic way. He was still seeing that at the same time, naturally we don't think of the body as something holistic, but the techniques, which mostly come also from a theoretical background, transferred then to the compositional and to the choreographic, they have other effects, and they could obtain to that modes of affectation as well. So I perhaps stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Kirsten. Anyone who has a question, please jump in. But I would like to briefly go back to this point of event versus maybe reflection or something. Like, I mean, in these examples, you mentioned some of them. We've heard of some others before. There's really, at the moment, quite a spectacle going on with all these big names and the Tate and Musée de la Danse and the before I mentioned Tino Segal, of course, and there's a whole marketing machine related to that, of course. At the same time, these the works themselves often are very withdrawn, like taking a step back, slowing down, very minimal. And I would like to hear your impression of what these dynamics, like how they seem to coincide, and what this says about these specific times we live in with the whole historical perspective you brought in.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it's again, also about two different framings, the framing of the museum and the framing of performance. I mean, you also mentioned yesterday the nomination of Kirsten as director of the Volksbühne now, and the struggles and the discussions which came along with it. Perhaps there are different. There's certainly one marketing aspect that you have several events instead of one exposition, which goes for 4 weeks, and you could have visitors coming more often. But I guess that's not the point, not the only one. There's this thing certainly going on, but the experience created for the beholders and for the audiences which come are, as you said, that they are slowed down. They draw on a specific other experience, which takes the slower time frames or the duration, and I guess it's also an interest of, I mean, you could better talk on that topic, I guess, what is the curatorial interest in it, and perhaps the framings about why to show these ephemeral art forms in this context of an art which gives certain frames also from its architectural, from its an architectural. I don't mean only the building here. I mean the whole framework of a museum, the whole setting which is given there, and to mix these both art forms. I mean, I think they are both the aspects of choreography as a spatial-temporal art form, which is not only the time-based art form, and the museum as well, which has a display of different spaces and how to deal with them, and how to make a process of how to pursue how to choreograph the different spaces, and what happens out of these decisions. How could people get together in those situations which are created? But still, the situations alone, I mean, we could also talk about the works of Tiranitia or Painu or other visual artists, but the framing for me, which is essential, is really about what happens to the specific, how is the specific knowledge of the dancers transmitted in this way, perhaps.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe, yes, this is actually a good point to continue with Laurence Rassel, who has some experience in these last mentioned questions of dealing with choreography in a very specific space. As I said before, Laurence Rassel is the director of Fundació Antonita Pies, and in 2012 she was responsible for the exhibition Retrospective, which took place there in Barcelona and was done by Xavier Leroy. Some of you might have seen it. It traveled afterwards to several places, I think, but MoMA appears one amongst them, and was an exhibition conceived as a choreography of actions that was carried out by performers, which inquired into various experiences about how we consume or produce time. I was quoting here from the announcement of the exhibition. Laurence used to be member, and I read also artistic director of Constant, a non-profit association in Brussels. That's an interdisciplinary arts lab dealing mostly with topics of free software, copyright alternatives, and cyberfeminism. And Laurence's practice is still very much informed by these issues. I won't say any more. Laurence, please.
Sorry, I have to speak from here. Can you hear me? Yes. Because Judith asked me to show you some images, and so I hope I will disappoint you, because I won't answer any question that was asked about, because I'm the director for Anthony Tapia's foundation for 2 days more, and that's over. So I quit. So there are a lot of things I could answer to Kirsten about what an institution is or should be, but then we can talk about this later. So yes, I wanted to first say, because I won't speak at the name of Xavier Leroy, of course, I will speak from my position, and who am I to speak to you, and who was I, or was I am, whatever, to invite Xavier Leroy to work in the Fondation Anthony Tapies. Just one word about the Fondation Anthony Tapies. It's a place in Barcelona. You will see some images in the video that is making exhibition like any other place, dealing with the collection of Anthony Tapies' work and performance, conference, music, workshop for kids, I mean, anything that a museum could be. But then when I was there, or I'm there, I arrived there, I was informed, as Judith said, by different concepts that are still in my body and my mind. One is technology. And when I think about technology, I'm not thinking only about the computers some of you are using, but about the type of relationships the technology is making us, or is creating in us, or is inducing in us, or is forcing us. Like, for example, the setting for me here, a stage is a technology that we can disconstruct, open, and develop, or act. So the institutional structure, architecture is a technology. So the type of relation, the power, so, well, next question. So I've decided to do this talk like this, like to put some flowers, cakes, notes, problems, stones on the table, and see if you can pick one of those to work on. The other thing for me that it's, even if this supposed social network is done with free software, I still do believe in free license, free software. I mean, I guess I would die still believe that it's a model we should work with. So I guess most of you know what free software, free license is, but I thought that it could be basically the freedom to run the program, the freedom to study how the program works, the freedom to redistribute copy, the freedom to improve the program. For me, this is also the cookbook and the recipe for an institution. We should be free, I mean, we should understand, be able to understand how the institution works. And for this, how can we open the code? So this is really something that it's nourished me, informed me when I invite Xavier Leroy. So I guess it's not, or I hope it, maybe it is what the directors of institutions are thinking when they invite choreographers to work with them, but mostly I think not, or what Kirsten suggested, not really. Next, feminism. How I practice feminism, I give you Virginia Woolf, well, it's still, I mean, it's still working. To say, okay, again, for me, there is something common with feminism, free and open source license and software. It is to be questioning to whom, where, in which condition, and what for. Every time, not taking anything for granted and anything for natural. Just ask the question again and again. This is how I practice feminism, to be able to see the spider web. How art become art, how an institution become an institution, how this happen, why, in which condition, what for. This is, well, I hope I practice. So, if I say this, there is a different way of being or try to work from a free open source software principle within an institution. One thing that we did, and I just closed that window immediately, we opened the institutional archive to the public. So people can have access to our archive to understand how we worked or how the foundation worked. So meaning to have access to all the technical drawing, budgets, everything. So people can work with the archive immediately. We tried, obviously, to digitize it and open it. We are still doing that, but this is a long series of questions of copyright, of right to access, and money. So what we did was to open the boxes, and some people can work with, and they're working because we have approached them. So I close this if you are interested by that. We can come back to this. Another thing that was important for me, working in the museum, this is something that really bugged me all the time. Whatever you do, the most important part of this is the person who is entering the place, is the encounter. I mean, like any encounter, all the prejudices that you have, meaning all the knowledge that you have, are functioning immediately. To read an artwork, to read, for example, how to circulate in this place, you have to use your knowledge of, I know this is a stage, I know this is a chair, I know that I have to be silent, or I can sit behind here, or I saw that person that went out. So we have codes to be used to be able to work out, understand, read the space. It's the same thing, I think, when we are in front of an artwork. Immediately there was a display of codes. Okay, this, that, not yet, well, I don't like it. But this is, for me, I've tried to slow down that moment of, no, come on, you are using a battery of knowledges, references, not knowing, so use it, show it. So this was for me really how to make people feel, be able to feel, to understand, to use their knowledge, and not to make like nothing happen. I know before I enter what I want to see. So all of this was occupying me when I invite Xavier Leroy. And if I invite Xavier Leroy to work for an exhibition, the invitation was for an exhibition, and I gave him carte blanche. I had no idea what he was going to do. What I knew, and I asked him, is to show how he works. But I didn't know if it will be bringing a library in the museum, showing movies. I mean, what I knew that Xavier has no props, so we won't reconstruct the costumes, the stage, like it was done, for example, with Marcus Cunningham exhibition, the Fondation, that you bring all the artworks that was within the stage, on the stage. And also, when we talked about this, it was not this big fashion and mode that now dance is every place. My question was, there were beautiful, amazing exhibition performance, for example, in Barcelona with Adrian Piper, Martha Rosler, John Jonas, and what you saw were documents of this performance, not the performance. Of course, I have the impression I talked to you from the last century, because now to have performance museum is like, oh, okay, come on, we all do that. But at that time, it was not. So also, what was the invitation to Xavier was not to make a work, but to make an exhibition. But he came back with this idea. I will show you some images. Let's move a bit. What's important also, because Kirsten mentioned the architecture and the structure, is like part of one stage of the institution, there is always a collection of Anthony Tapier's work. So you have tourists that come and put an audio guide. And so the audio guide is the choreographer of the museum. He determines the space, the time, the movement. So some people were, and Xavier thought of this work looking at, he came beforehand to see how the people circulate in the space, how long they stay, and use the 3 stages of the Fondation. So we knew that the people who coming directly to see Tapies, they would go down with the audio guide, and at the beginning it was, okay, ignore completely what was happening, and the moment was to decide when they took out the audio guide, and did let the encounter happen. For me at the beginning, as Judith said, this project traveled in Rennes, Musée de la Danse, in Hamburg, in Centre Pompidou, in PS1, in Singapore, in Rio, and it will travel again. I was wondering how that can happen. And because it was thought for that time frame, for that architecture, with that museum, when I can decide to move the chairs, to not having any words on the wall, to get rid of the guards, to climb on the wall, anything. I was responsible for that. But then I understand that I was stupid, of course, because this was where he tried and make as a laboratory, what would be used, and to be able to transport the project, because he designed like a mechanism, if you want to. Do you want me to explain more about retrospective, or I go out like this? I go on? Okay. So what was not visible in the video is that most of the time, as you experience, that most of the time there was a moment of conversation. I mean, suddenly the space was looking like this. So some of the dancers were explaining, for example, people were there in the middle and say, there is nothing, but I'm here, but I see nothing. There is nothing to see. So this idea that people would be the work and would answer, but I don't know how to make you understand, but for me it's the same as happening when there is a painting on the wall. There could be nothing also. And this is really, I don't know how to, well, we talk about this later. So there was the space of event, if you may say, of exhibition. People enter and will trigger the process, the mechanism, and they could just see, contemplate, or interact if they want to, or just stay there. Of course, the idea of retrospective is to understand that how the exhibition work, but how dance work, and how dance brought by a choreographer into another, the choreographer, dancer, interpreter, actor. This one has to use the memory of the body and the movement to be able to rework. And downstairs there was a place where people could rehearse and ask. So the place where the documents were. So to say, what the hell was that? Because most of the people do not know about Xavier Leroy in Barcelona or wherever. And so they entered directly to space, and they could go downstairs and see, okay, this is the different choreographies, this is where it comes from. So the dancers, interpreters, actors could work, or choreographers, because there were a lot of different people there, and the spectators could look at the document. This is another place that was inside retrospective. That was the dark room that Xavier was supposed to rehearse there every day, and he did not. He was staying like a football trainer around the field all day. But then he made a work from that for the festival here in Essen in 12 rooms. So that was interesting because there were some puppets inside, and people were spending a lot of time there, kissing, sleeping, or not entering because they were afraid. So this space, I mean, of course, some museum would not do that because you can't let the dark room and people do whatever they want inside there. We have no cameras in that one. Huh? But there was a diary of the participants there. So maybe I will finish with Alan Capro, because as I say, for me, the invitation to Xavier was to make tangible the conditions of work, the conditions of perception, the conditions of relation inside what's happening in the exhibition space, or it could be any perception space, I would say. Of course, I wanted, because Judith asked me in a Q&A that we had, how does it influence the institution itself? I mean, most of the museum institutions are doing that. Nothing. I mean, to have dance in the museum is the same that you have, I don't know, paintings or any exhibition. Doesn't change anything of how the institution work. I mean, in terms of power, of economy, of ecology. What we try to speak about the budget, the dancers and the interpreters had the budget in their hands, so they knew exactly how we worked. I mean, that was clear how we. I mean, this is, I do with every curator and artist. They have the budget. I did. And so the other thing that you were talking about ephemeral, one other example that we worked with was Alan Capro. And because for me, Alan Capro, that was my dream to do so when I was in Constant, because that was the open source artist, right? Because you have the instruction and you can reinvent the work based on the instruction. And Capro himself said that you have to adapt them to the practicality of their time. So he wanted someone to be responsible for the reinvention. So using the conditions of work, possibility of their time, to reenact the present, not the past. But also we were inspired by Alain Capro himself when he did an exhibition called Proceedings. He said the only way to make a retrospective of performance happening artists was storytelling, was memory. That it was no use to remake the work as it was, because that was not what it was. But what was important was the memory of it. So he did an exhibition by storytelling. And so this was, I mean, this is a text that he wrote, but talking about himself, where he mentioned, maybe I read and I finish on this. So this was the space that we had, that was the exhibition space, and so we opened it empty. And so people had access to the documents of Capro as documents. Because I would not put a facsimile of instruction on the vitrine, right? But the original instruction cannot get out of the Getty. So what you can have a facsimile. Of course, we could do this full of vitrine, big screens with video, but this is not the work. The work of Capro has to be reinvented somewhere else. So this was, well, you know, obviously all of this. So the space of action, event, or whatever, but outside the museum. In the schools with extraordinary happenings and so on. But maybe I finish on this. The problem that I encounter, for example, as director of the museum, what about the public, the audience? The numbers entering the museum go down because I have no proof. I could tag, put a chip on every school kids or students or prisoners who did participate to Alain Capro happening, to be able to count them. Because, of course, what's happening is outside the space. It can be the countryside, the schools or whatever, but because we did what Capro did in museum, inside museum, but the rest was somewhere else. So, but then we encounter the ecology, the economy of the museum. So maybe I finish here, no? Is it you? Yeah, we have enough stones, flowers, cakes. None.
I have a lot of questions. Some other people might.
Well, I have to say also, because there is a beautiful conversation with of Capro that is recognizing the influence of feminism in his work, which is something that is not well known and well spread, but he said that what was more important in his work was to put in common at the end of the experience. And that's something that he learned from the consciousness raising session that women and artists were doing together. And this is for him the work, how we share the memory and what happened for you. So let's stop here. Up.
Thank you very much. Maybe, yes, you join us here, and I can ask at least some of my questions. Maybe sticking to this term of memory, I was wondering, you said when you do a project like this, that was probably polemic, but the institution doesn't change at all, like the hierarchies, that's very clear to me, but I would imagine that still having done something like the retrospective, with everything you do afterwards, the space must have changed a bit, at least in the perception of the visitors who come back. And I was wondering how you perceive that kind of change, like the institution as a space that is connected to a certain approach towards art. How did that change with that specific?
Well, you're optimistic to say that people will come back.
Okay.
Because that was my hope somehow, that the people who will go through the experience of retrospective could come back to the exhibition of tapirs that I showed, that when I hang the painting standing in the room instead of putting them in the wall, to make understand also the body of the spectator and the body, the materiality of the works. What happened in Barcelona is that it connected different audiences. so that the dancers, performers, and visual artists met suddenly and were there in the room. And so because we did also project with sound, and so this kind of network, and as I'm living now, people tell me about that there were some networks that would, created by this kind of meeting there, conversation they could have with, because also all the interpreters, dancers, or actors were based in Barcelona. So that makes you also more intimate with the person when you meet. For example, it happened to me in Centre Pompidou when I saw one of the performers. She told about her trajectory, how she arrived to dance, and she even spoke about her underwear in Moscow and so on and so forth. And then a month or a year after, I saw her in Barcelona in Anna Teresa Kersmacher piece, and as I was looking at her, I said, but I know her underwear. How can that be possible? And it was this kind of, even I saw someone in Berlin that I say hello to, but she didn't know me, but I didn't know her about her trajectory. So this kind of intimacy is more what I would say, but, well, sorry, I'm too long.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to watch time a bit, so maybe we come back to this very interesting project later and continue with a kind of similar approach, I would say, with Manuel Pelmus, unless there are questions now. No. Yes, okay. So Manuel Pelmus is a choreographer from Bucharest. And as I said earlier, he has worked mostly in the visual arts context over the last 2 years at least. And in 2013, he represented Romania at the 55th Venice Biennale, together with Alexandra Pirici, with the project an immaterial retrospective of the Venice Biennale, which caused quite a stir, I think. And he was awarded the Berlin Art Prize for Performing Arts in 2012. His work has been presented in various art institutions internationally. One of them is the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which will be at the center of the next talk. Manuel has also presented his work at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. That piece was entitled Public Collection of Modern Art. And this one will actually be transferred to Kassel in an adapted version as part of the 60 Years of Documenta program from 17th of July. That's an advertisement for all of you. So Manuel, please tell us more about your work.
Okay, I will begin, and I really timed, because we are on a panel about temporality and time, I really timed this intervention, so I will really stick with the 10 minutes, so bear with me. And this is an image just to give you a feeling about the work and what the work I do together with Alexandra might look like. This is from a recent work entitled Public Collection, not of modern art, but Public Collection. It's at the M Museum in Leuven. And it's an enactment of an Ai Weiwei work, which is called Study of Perspective. But yeah, I just leave it there. At the end, if there is time and desire to see more, I don't know if we have internet, I can show you more, but I thought... So I will begin by quoting a recent article that I've read in the New Yorker by well-known art historian Hall Foster, in which he's quite skeptical, quite critical to this so-called performance turn in the visual arts and the museum. And I'm quoting it not because I necessarily agree with him, quite on the contrary, but because I think it touches on general concerns regarding this turn that are anyway floating in the air. Some of those I've heard today, and it connects also to the topic of the panel. And then I will read a few lines that I wrote myself, but before reading this article of Hal Foster. So it's not meant as a response, it's meant more like to reflect on the same issues and also touching on the panel topics. So, can I put it? Okay. Maybe just, sorry, I don't see. So, quote from Hal Foster, which is also quite random. I just took very little, so I hope I don't do injustice to him. He says, "Spectacle is here to stay, at least as long as capitalism is, and museums are part of it. That's a given. But for that very reason, it shouldn't be a goal. Consider the turn to performance and dance, and the restaging of historical examples of both in art museums over the last few years. The Marina Abramovic retrospective at MoMA in 2010 is a representative instance. This turn can be seen negatively as an institutionalization of one's alternative practices, or positively as the recovery of otherwise lost events. But this doesn't explain the sudden embrace of live events in institutions otherwise dedicated, I find this interesting, to inanimate art. A central role of the museum is to operate as a space-time machine. This access to various thens and nows is especially urgent during an era of what he calls consumerist presentism. In the whole article, he's like looking at this investment into the present as something that responds to this consumerist presentism. And then he ends with, in the end, if museums aren't places where different constellations of past and present are crystallized, why have them at all? Okay, end of quote. We often use enactment as a strategy for addressing issues related to memory, history, construction of history, and production of subjectivity within today's economy of experience. Our work is set in relation to the wider yet specific history of the museum as a place for producing and distributing knowledge, and one in which long-term politics are played out. If we agree that the museum reflects the kind of society that has produced it and its economy, then it should now reflect and address the profound shifts in today's society. These range from technological change to rather radical adjustments in the production of subjectivity, as well as an overall move toward immaterial production. Besides history and memory, economy and value or values become pressing issues. Now connecting to some of the topics that you mentioned. Live events, dance, concerts regularly appear in today's exhibitions, biennials, and museum programs. While it is not the first time that the performance has entered the museum, live events are more intensely present in the circuit of visual arts, taking center stage. This shift corresponds to the concurrently widespread of economy of experience and attention. Therefore, the performative turn is often criticized as a capitulation of critical art in front of spectacle and the demands of neoliberal society. It is also accused of emptying performance of its critical edge, which it supposedly once possessed, by commodifying performance, making performance participate in the art market, thereby causes it to lose its formerly radical attitude. However, I do not think that things are that easy to classify. Live events, being more and more in demand, can also offer an opportunity to address and redefine the limits of institutions and their politics. Historically speaking, many performance artists emphasized the uniqueness of their performances. The fact that they could not be repeated meant they resisted circulation within the market, rendering them risky and radical. But the reality of that claim, in most cases, not to generalize, was that the majority of performance artists had to sell documentation or objects related to their performances in order to survive. This situation is perhaps best described in a random quote from renowned artist Mladen Stilinovic, when confronted with the general perception that his famous photographic series entitled Artist at Work, I don't know if you are familiar with that work, it's basically showing Stilinovic in his bed, kind of sleeping or just waking up from a deep sleep. So, when confronted, that his famous photographic series entitled Artist at Work was originally a performance, Mladen Stilinovic says, quote, "In the 70s, when I did this, I was thinking about performance. What is it? When it is finished, you must have a video or a photography. So why do performance in the public space?" End of quote. One could say that instead of subverting the art market, the body and performance practice of that period, mainly the 60s and 70s, was just cheap in terms of costs and did not really challenge the traditional formats of the exhibition or the market. This is not meant to dismiss or mock the legitimate concerns and practices of performance artists then, many of which I do admire, but to revisit their claims from the perspective of today, almost 50 years later. I see a chance to contribute further to an ongoing debate about the live presence inside the museum, in which live events are not simply instrumentalized at very low cost to merely animate events, but are valued as equal elements in the exhibition display, challenging the established hierarchies. One way to do this is by using a different time frame or temporality than is expected from live works inside the museum. We install our ongoing action for longer periods of consecutive days so that we don't reproduce a one-time only event logic. We insist on a structure that invites the visitor to spend and invest time in following the development of the work, which often takes more hours to unfold, so that it's not easily viewed and consumed. This should translate hopefully into bigger budgets for the live events, claiming a more equal distribution of the existing economy. History and memory play an important role in the work. It is a specific practice which proposes an embodied history in the bodies of performers. One could argue that the work functions as a display for sharing knowledge in action. It is activated by performers as opposed to a standstill display. It is not a fixed, frozen history, but one that tries to engage the viewer on several levels of perception. By claiming, demonumentalizing, and setting history to a human scale, our work seeks to produce a certain tension with the fixed and big history, to open up the possibility for transformation. In that sense, one is invited inside a frame, which can be used for transmitting knowledge through bodies, and on a scale, the human body, to which the viewer can relate to. In a museum of the future, I think that experience, intersubjectivity, and embodied history should have a place. That's it. If you want to see more images, but maybe after, if the questions are...
I think it's yeah, if you want to join us again.
Okay,
yeah. I've been wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the actual process of work that you've been doing in these past 2 years, and for example, in your Biennale project, how did you go about it? Because I don't know how familiar you are, but maybe you can just explain a bit what you did and how you did it.
I mean, the Biennale was quite a specific context for many reasons. One being that, you know, the pavilion, the Romanian pavilion, we were the only ones in the pavilion, so, and the Biennale lasts for 6 months. So you have to create a certain structure to somehow fill this place up, not because you want to fill it. I mean, for some people, you know, it was like, oh, there's nothing here. A bit of what you said. So it was quite specific in the sense that we referred the history of the Biennale, so the retrospective term is used, not ironically, but in a way it's like claiming the entire history of the, let's say, the oldest and most prestigious biennale in the world, is on one way, like, for us was like in the Romanian pavilion, so to claim that history was also kind of a political gesture, but also an impossibility, of course, because I don't think even the biennale cannot do a comprehensive or an exhaustive retrospective, because it's like thousands of millions of works. So we proposed, yes, to descale and demonumentalize somehow even the institution of the biennale itself. But not, what is maybe important is not by an iconoclast gesture or by going against it, but by somehow proposing quite a playful display. And we were interested more in this claiming of the history and descaling it. Yeah. To be more specific for those who don't know it, just in a few words, we basically enacted works of art from the history of the Biennale, but also there was because the works of, like, let's say, pictures of paintings enacted or of sculptures circulate much more on the net, so people are more familiar with that. But we also did a lot of events, or like, for example, in the '68 there was lots of protests at the Biennale. In '74 there was this kind of extraordinary Biennale which was completely dedicated to the anti-fascist struggle in Chile. So basically there was no Biennale, somehow it was all with invited artists from Chile, and somehow, yeah, completely on this issue. So we also enacted some of those, so it wasn't... and with the later work, sorry, now I speak too much. With the later work, like public collection, it does not... Then we did another one which was called Just Pompidou It, at Centre Pompidou. The title was Just Pompidou It, which was also kind of referring the institution. But then with the later works like public collection or public collection of modern art, it's not so site-specific. It doesn't deal with one institution or one place, but it enters in dialogue more with history or history of art more in general.
So I was actually wondering about that, because Laurence before told about the question of how to transfer this kind of performance to another space. So how do you do it? Like right now?
With public collection is quite easy, because, as I said, it is not site-specific. With a work like Just Pompidou It or the retrospective of the Venice Biennale, it's more difficult, I think. We got proposals for this retrospective of the Venice Biennale, but it doesn't really work so easily. It was kind of designed for that context,
Mm-hmm. Any question? No. Actually, I would like to jump back very quickly to Laurence. No? Okay, you're curious. Okay, we jump back afterwards. I keep it in mind. So, yes, Daniel. Daniel Kötter, we invited Daniel because, yes, he also works a lot with crossing borders between the disciplines. He is a studied, how do you translate Musikwissenschaft, musicologist, really, okay, and a film director, but has worked a lot recently with experimental music theater, and combines techniques of structuralist film with documentary elements and these music theater elements. He deliberately chooses to work between different media contexts. So he's shown his work in galleries, at video festivals, in concert halls, and in theaters. One of his most recent projects is a trilogy, which is still in the process of being completed. 2 works have been completed. It's called Ökonomien des Handels, Kredit, Recht und Liebe. So it's about credit of finances, the law and love. It's quite a big project, I guess. It explores the basic conditions of social interaction with the means of film and composition. That's what I read. Maybe you can tell us more, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation as well. I might maybe start here and then go and show a specific example. I mean, I never worked academically on temporality, so I just can't tell about my everyday experience as someone who works in between the fields. So temporality, of course, occurs when you're an experimental documentary filmmaker with a background in music and theater, whatever that may mean. Of course, in the process of the making, especially of a film, you have to make technical decisions about camera movement, length of shot, length of the work itself, and already these kind of decisions define the way the work will find its way in the different institutions. So I struggle actually every day to make decisions because my work has been shown in galleries and museums, but usually I prefer to show them in the cinema. But then again, it's very differently perceived depending on if it's shown in documentary film festivals or experimental film festivals or festivals that focus more on fiction films. And it's also always a different temporal regime. And of course, on top of that, when I show my film in performative context, that again creates another temporal regime that's, well, I don't have to deal with, but the audience in the end has to deal with because the context is differently. And then, of course, the next step is I'm now in the process of publishing some of my films on DVD. Do I really want to give it out to people going home with an object and watch it in I don't know what context? And of course, I'm constantly asked to like send a link, internet link to my works, which again creates a very different kind of context. I mean, this was widely discussed, of course, the difference between museum, cinema, and now the way of perceiving films in the internet. So I thought I might just show you a different example from my most recent music theater project. Also because we're talking a lot here about the borders between disciplines, the borders between art genres, between different media, as if they were actually given by some divine authority and not reconfirmed by each and every practice and action that we undertake in the moment we do them. And that is actually something that was important in this last project, which has not as a subject the borders between different disciplines, but the creation of borders through legal systems. So it's a project in law and about what is created in the moment when a law has to be established in terms of boundaries and borders of territory, like imaginary territory, but also like the real territory, like the physical territory. So this piece was called Recht, and I'm a filmmaker. I collaborate on my music theater projects together with a composer called Hannes Seidel since 8 years. And for this project, we decided to have a very clear divide, not because we work on everything together. He does as much as I do for the film than I do for the music, since I studied musicology. He allows me to have a say in that. But we decided to have a very clear distinction on stage between the film part and the more concert part. And I'm going to show you some excerpts from this project. So, unlike the other projects we were talking about earlier, the time frame of here is very clearly set because it's a performance, it's in a theater. People gather, the lights go off, and it starts in the beginning, and we have all the same shared time. So that's a very strict and conservative frame. But then within this frame, we try to establish other divisions and break them. So on the left side of the stage, we have the film, and maybe, yeah, you can see it here. Maybe I should quickly explain what we did. We established two different spaces. The one was an island in the Mosel River in front of the village Schengen. We invited a couple of experts on law to gather there for 24 hours, another temporal frame that we set, to discuss a new legal system. Very naive and deliberately naive task that we gave them. And we filmed them, we gave them like a setup and some material and some text, but the rest was just documentary film for those 24 hours. And this is what the film on the left side is made out of. And on the right side you see the concert stage, inhabited by the Ensemble Nadar from Belgium. And we also rehearsed with them according to a certain regime of rules and temporal regime between improvisation and fixed score, and like superimposed these two regimes with a clear spatial divide between the two media, film and concert stage. So on the left side you can see the camp.
Talking about a new order just
and
for Europe.
then quite in the beginning of the piece, there is this moment where the lawyer starts talking, and they talk about, in this moment, about the dissolving inner borders that create outer borders, which counts for the legal system as much as for the different systems of art forms and institutions that we create. And at the same time, two of the musicians actually leave the concert stage to appear in the film and get the instrument cases. And of course that's a cheap joke, I know. And then the moment they leave the frame of the film again, they reappear on stage and unpack the instruments. So we try to kind of connect these two spaces with each other, also with their different temporalities.
Also Grenzen können ja konstituiert werden entlang beliebiger Kriterien oder Merkmale. Das heißt, in dem Moment,
unfortunately, it's not clearly visible in this, but I don't have any other documentation for this.
Neue Grenzen geschaffen worden, und zwar nicht nur an den Außengrenzen, und das scheint mir ein wichtiger
But what was important is that the topic of creating legal borders was here associated with the actual use of space and media that we tried to set up.
Konstituiert, erfunden, und sie wurde fließend. Das Bild des Schlagbaums verschwindet und die Grenze ist noch da, sie ist beweglich, aber sie ist nicht mehr sichtbar. Sie ist vor allem für die nicht sichtbar, die Freizügigkeit genießen.
So once you create a border, of course it tells you the territorial validity of this border of the regime, and it also tells you what's inside and what's outside, obviously. And here, very obviously, the island and the film is the outside of the music theater stage, because it brings
on upholding rights and freedoms of citizens that have occupied territory.
Yeah, okay. So obviously it's the outside space, and which is a good thing of using video on the music theater stage. Stop it for a moment. Is that you can show outside spaces, but in the excerpt that you just saw, we also reversed it, because through the radio and people reading text on stage with the radio voice, we made the actual music theater stage the outside world of this closed camp for the experts on law. But also, if you create this kind of two regimes and the two kind of media and bring them together, superimpose them on the same stage, you have to make sure that they're not like always being simultaneous, or that they have a specific relation to each other. So what we just did, also very simply, when the experts on law had their discussions, the musicians would kind of listen to the discussions, and the other way around here as well. As you can see, the musicians sit on these pallets, which also reappear in the film, and sometimes they play music for the musicians, for the experts on law in the film. So again, another technique to create links between the two different media and the two different temporalities. And then there's one thing, of course, we all know stage is undivided time that we all share, while film at least has the opportunity, unless we're talking about plan sequences, has the opportunity to jump in time. And so the entire film is edited in jump cuts, and they're actually created by, again, the musicians, which you can see here. They have this trigger.
was ich in der Hand habe und wo mein souveränes Bewusstsein darüber verfügt. Und das souveräne Bewusstsein des Subjektes verfügt über kein Recht und wird es auch nicht, glaube ich.
Let's propose what I wrote and let's see whether we can make that work. Those restricted by boundaries must be able to struggle against their inclusion or exclusion, and they must also be able to leave. A just order depends on a space for contestation.
But I would change the phrase completely. Ich kann meine Skepsis auch einfach zurückstellen. But this is a problem with becoming concrete.
Okay. So that is another kind of ironic try to play with the different temporalities of the stage and the film. All of these examples are, of course, within the framework of a finalized product on stage that we all share. But actually, for me, it's the really interesting thing starts that when we talk about where we present this show, because since we both connected to the contemporary music world and to the performing arts world, sometimes we're invited by contemporary music festivals and sometimes we're invited by performing arts festivals. So the audience is very different. So actually it's perfect because we can also apply for funding from both scenes. So it's very luxury and convenient. But of course the problem starts then in the moment of perception and the expectation of the people. When they arrive, if it's a contemporary music audience or if it's a performing arts audience, it's very interesting to see how they react, especially to a project like this where you have like the film on the left side and the music on the right side and they're kind of competing with each other. And of course then if we want to go with this the onion skin a bit further, what kind of reviewer is sent by the newspapers? Is it someone who just knows about contemporary music? And so on and so on. So yeah, it's actually interesting for me to be in between the scenes because it always reveals and makes me not forget about the condition of possibility and the frames that each of these kind of setups that we understand as given bring about. And yeah, I would be very bored to just work in one art form, in one institution. Okay, that's actually all I wanted to share for now with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very interested in this issue of dealing with different audiences, showing them the same work and getting reactions that differ. Maybe you could give an example of, do you have something you can think of where that happened, like where what kinds of things would a specific audience see or hear that another audience, that wouldn't work for another audience because they wouldn't be aware of what's happening or would not understand? Or?
I mean, I never made a representative survey of the reactions of our audience, of course, so I can just report like individual or like groups of people reacting or depending on the context. But I mean, what's very obvious is, of course, that you find much more time structure related way of perception in audience that is trained to listen to complex musics. For example, while when you talk to a performing arts audience, I don't want to say that they don't have this kind of perception, of course they do, but it's just a different tendency. They would rather talk about the content of this piece, for example, like why the experts on law failed to create a new law order, and the performativity of the musicians on stage, what it means that we actually create a concert situation on stage that at the same time has some performative framing, at least when they are on this stage of palettes, which is a stage on a stage. So you can see that there are different tendencies in understanding what's actually happening. But of course goes back to knowledge, but also to what you're used to. Because I think also the same people would expect something else when they go to see the same piece in a contemporary music festival. They would question why this was invited to a contemporary music festival, although most of the time there are some people speaking in a film and there's not much music happening. So things like this. So
yeah,
I mean, it's banal, but of course, in a way, it does change the piece also.
Would you, drawing from your experience now, would you change the framing or the information you give to different audiences? Would you explain more when you show your work in a specific context, or are you just counting on the work to have its effect the way it does, or just to
I mean, beforehand, no, but of course, in like after show talks or something, I would say different things, knowing who was the audience. Explain, I mean, if the questions come, why are the musicians there? It's much easier to explain to a contemporary music audience and why they're doing what they're doing than to a performing arts audience or a film audience.
Are there any questions? No. I would maybe like to connect to this and go back to Manuel and ask you if you've had or how you have worked with this problem of your work demanding or building on a preliminary knowledge of the works you are reenacting. How did you deal with that? Because Laurence before told us about the downstairs room for explanation. Did you have any kind of way for people to find out more? Or?
So you mean in terms of like information, like the reference and how? Yes. I mean, the structure in a sense is quite simple. I mean, we use enactment because we think that somehow the works that are enacted or the events are somehow a starting point or a pretext to transform it, sometimes from a medium to another, and sometimes even like transform the work. So it's just a starting point, and it's kind of a new work actually. But the enactment that there is a list, and also before we do it, before each piece is enacted, it's usually announced, or it's announced very simple, like the author and the medium and so on, or it's even more text, like for example, we enacted this Hans Hacke German pavilion, which was like kind of one of the most famous, not most famous, but that everyone seemed to remember that pavilion, and that's a question is not just to it's not to reenact it, it's not to do it as it was, because that's impossible. Basically, for those of you who don't know, like, Hans Hacke basically broke the floor, smashed the floor of the German pavilion, the marble floor, which was installed somehow by Hitler. Not by Hitler personally, but because he thought it's not monumental enough. So the visitors, beside other few things, the visitors would come in the pavilion, the German pavilion, and find this smashed floor. Yeah. So how do you so we announced the work, we explained a little bit, and then you have to find a way, a very simple way with 5 bodies to somehow come to that work, And just to give you the example, so it's more concrete, we ask the performers to very gently roll. We had 5 performers, very close to the feet of the audience, but not hitting them, but close. So somehow you would have to decide whether you step over them or step back, or you stay there. So it creates a certain, not even an obstacle, but somehow a certain situation. Yeah, I could continue, but yeah. So that's how they find out also about what work it is.
Kirsten, you have.
Interesting, also what you mentioned before, so it's always what kind of aspect you refer to in a certain work, how you translate it, because it's always different if you translate a sculptural or installational work of art or a painting into a reenactment by the bodies or a construction. So this kind of perhaps call it compositional level, which you add to it, gives something different, and that's also this historical aspect which you mentioned. So it's not by having this periodizing function of this was then, this is now. So looking at history in a way of perhaps it's different.
That you try to sort of actualize it also in the bodies,
Actualize it and then invent something new. But what does it tell to us today? So how do we use it? How construct a different aspect of it, and So actualizing history in a way that it makes it useful for further dealing with it. And no, but what I wanted to say, what I found interesting in all these three things is really this dealing with so-called ephemeral art forms in a way, and having this framework of how do the certain techniques of specific art forms, like in film, like in dance and performance, how do they contribute to something which is not an object art form in the end, but which is still fleeting in a way, but which is shown and exposed, exhibited in a certain way. But still, how do these techniques and practices contribute to it and keep it in this process of a continuous project of actualization? And the third thing was this aspect of, then I stop again, but this third aspect of, I had in all these three cases a very different work, this impression of, when we go back to this question of institutions, that it's not dealing against institutions, but playing with it, really. It's like really dealing with the structures and making them useful. So very much changing this attitude of the 70s also and the 60s. And yeah.
I think it was almost the same question I had, but just one part. You know, it's fine, thanks. It was the question of reenactment. Okay. Because I think you were, I was just a question, I just keep it on, because you speak about reenactment, but at this time when it's not a reenactment anymore because you transform the work.
Yeah, so because with some works, I mean, the reenactment presupposes that you redo something, but it hasn't been done. I mean, like, you know, for example, this work of the Hans Hacke, our version, let's say, reenactment is, you know, it's not really a reenacting it because it doesn't try to reproduce that exactly, you know, like all the elements. So it's some kind of also a new work, you know, that refers to that. And that is announced also, so people have this information.
I would like to continue actually on what you said about the topic of changing things, and I think all three of you have been working a lot, like all this working between things, overlaying one system over the other in order to bring about productive confrontation, is aiming for some kind of change, I would say, or I would ask you actually if you see it that way, and if you think the current cultural landscape or art landscape is in some kind of change, or do you feel it's more stable categories of disciplines that you are free to experiment with, but that basically remain stable and remain constant? Can you relate to that question, any of you three actually? No. Okay.
I mean, the problem starts in the moment where we consider art forms and institutions as a substantial given. That's what I mentioned before. The moment where we approach them from a more practical side, that there is a frame that we can use, and we should just be aware of what that frame produces also. It will automatically change it because practices are contingent. I mean, they don't fit, or there are sometimes, of course, artists that want to be in the market, they fit into existing patterns, of course, yeah, we all know that. But the actual everyday practice of artists does already change institutions. Which doesn't mean that we need to talk about funding structures and that they need to be less rigid, maybe. But I mean, architecture is changed by artists all the time. Temporal regimes are changed all the time. But not because they want to maybe change deliberately or they decide to break or go against, but because they just work. And I think that is maybe a relief to see it from that perspective rather than to see it from the other perspective. Say, I mean, I know, of course, programmers and academics have a different perspective on it because they need also a way to talk about it. But maybe we can also change the way to talk about it.
Maybe just a short thing. I prefer to use this word borrowed from Iri Drogov, that you work undisciplined rather than interdisciplinary, because like interdisciplinary still presupposes a discipline somehow, you know. So I think this undisciplined is has more potential somehow.
Laurence?
Yeah, two things. The thing about undisciplined and about because working with Capro and so on, the idea of rules, and so I was also a lot thinking when I was there about hospitality. How can you be hospitable and be a good hostess in the also a feminist sense? And the idea of hospitability is like, I would misquote Derrida, so I won't even try. It's like you can give the keys of your house, but that means that you are the owner of the house, so you can give the keys. So to be hospitable is not defining the rules of being hospitable, it's just give the house. So I was like, okay, this is not exactly what we are doing. There are some rules of the house, but what we can do is like to play the house. So we change the rules, meanwhile we're playing, because Capro is explaining when you see people playing or kids playing, they redefine the rules. Like, now you do that, but if you switch to that, and to be able to have this flexibility in terms of institutions, to change the rules according to the work you are developing, this is something. And now the dark side of it, yes, the institutions are changing, but I mean, what we have to do, I don't know here, but it's really the problem of funding and the contracts, I mean, in terms of public institutions. I mean, this is something that's happening all around Europe. I mean, the States and other countries are working differently, so it's not about complaining, it's about the rules are changing, the set of rules are changing, and I would love to be that transparent. It's fair enough if we have to deal with big companies and so on and so forth, but then the contracts, the deal of powers and so on and so forth. So it's a bit tiring to see the big institutions making like nothing happening. Meanwhile, it's happening. I'm not saying it's bad, or maybe it's really bad, but let's put the contracts, the systems out of that. So this is for me what's changing. I mean, what I've seen change. I'm older than those the last decade. Is really the set of rules. Or of course, I'm a product of circumstances of welfare state in Belgium, and so this is completely different. I'm contaminated by this, or what was supposed to be expected with some system. So the system is changing, and it's good. It would be good if we can participate of the set of rules of contracts, or ownership or not ownership, and if we can still play with this. So the idea of changing the rules. So this is why I'm saying maybe yes, the institutions are not much affected by what's happening in the exhibitions, if it's not affecting how the circulation of power, money, and so on and so forth. I have a question for Daniel. Why didn't you also, because the musician, they are, it's a set of rules with improvisation, and why don't we have live the lawyers also camping, or because you are going to tell me you're making a movie, so it's not, but you have this kind of set of, I was wondering if it would have been possible to have those two stages in the same.
Yeah, I mean, of course it's possible, and these things are done in performing arts a lot, but first of all, it was important to have these two different spaces, with one which is outside, one which is inside. Second, the two different temporalities, the 24 hours that need to be cut down to the 1 hour of the stage performance. And third, which is a more pragmatic thing, is that I prefer to give a framework to people that they feel safe with what they're doing according to their profession. And of course, I mean, even this camp was awkward in the beginning for them, but they adjusted, and then it was really about talking about law, and putting them on stage makes them at the same time a performer that they are not professional in, while the musicians are highly professional in performing on stage music and scores. So that's another technique to have them all act according to their professions.
Any more comments? Kirsten?
Just again, to go back to this, we were very much talking about rules and to know the rules and to play with the rules. So going back again to the 60s, forgive me, but so this relationship between the score or the set of rules and their I would rather not say execution, but their interpretation. So that what Cage makes with his notion of indeterminacy. So perhaps having this openness to play with it in a way that there comes in what you told also about the carousel, about the imaginary, about some incomplete stories which could add to it, or when you go back to the instructions Simone Forti gave to her works. So you have this whole set of practices again which could transform the rules from another point of view. So there are different methods of perhaps dealing with rules, and then again deriving from different parts of knowledge, also from knowing how knowing that to use these two terms again, how do they influence each other, and yeah, it was just coming to my mind, and transferring this also then to this play with the institutional patterns as well. Yeah.
No, but I think, I mean, that I even wrote it down, like there's been a lot of, I mean, I followed the panel in German as well, and I could follow till a certain point. But you know, those references are coming constantly back. Yeah, we refer the 60s and the 70s, which is fine. I mean, there's no problem. But at the same time, I think that, you know, like for example, in the end of the 80s or in the beginning of the 90s, both like in dance, somehow this legacy of the Judson Church was somehow continued in a way by a group of choreographers, and also like in visual arts, if you think of like, I don't know, Philippe Pareno or like Pierre Huyghe or so on, I think there's also different ways of playing with this, not only with the institutions, but also with what an exhibition or what a performance could be, which revisits or, you know, also sometimes integrates the criticality or some of the proposals from the 60s and 70s. But I think also they also invested very differently, you know, like they don't refuse seduction, they are not so afraid of spectacularity and so on, you know, and there's a more hybrid kind of exhibition that takes place, you know, in which you have not this kind of separation that is operated in some museums, like for example in Pompidou. It's not negative, it was made in a certain point where you have like the exhibition space and then you have the theater, you know. It's not this separation, but like for example in a display like Huyghe or Pareno, you have, I don't know, films and live performance and so on coexisting somehow. It's a kind of more hybrid display, you know. Sorry, I didn't mean it as a criticism. Yeah. I just wrote it down because I thought.
Yeah. It was just that's why I also mentioned Mette Ingwertsen with his Yes Manifesto, and this why I'm so keen to talk about technique, because this is this other history which is not in dance, which is not so much talked about, even in the studies of dance scholars. This whole other heritage of the Judson Church, which emerged from that, this knowledge in different practices, and which came along again some years ago, and some.
But for example, sorry to. I don't want to monopolize, so just stop me. I mean, just also for the less specialized audience and like this, I mean, like for example, you mentioned Judson Church and this democratic body and walking and so on. I think, for example, in the work of Jérôme Bell, you can find some kind of Steve Paxton, but with some sort of Warholian take, you know? I mean, it's very popish. He says often in his interviews that his strategy is, for example, to not look down on the audience, which is something that you also find in Pierre Huyghe, or you find also in Jeff Koons in a certain tricky way. You know, like there is this thing that, you know, like the minimal and minimalists and a lot of the avant-gardes were also, I mean, they wanted to democratize, but there was also this alienation effect that was happening because the form was very austere, yeah, very like, yeah. So, you know, I'm just like how do you say, like just trying to think of how those legacies are also rethought, you know, in also the light of what I said, like experience economy and so on, which is not refused, but played with in a way. So, for example, you taking into consideration attention span of today, which is very different, yeah, because of digital and technology and so on. Yeah, of course, it's not something that is good or bad. It simply is, you know. So to keep someone, to ask them to look at some kind of very long movie in a very difficult form might be, I don't know, interesting, but I'm not sure that the attention span is there, and so on, you know. So I'm sorry, I'm a bit messy. But
speaking of attention spans, I think
are you losing
we really. Oh, there's a comment. Okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, it's my fault again for keeping us here too long. Maybe this works as a comment as well. There were two thoughts that had been in my head across many of the comments, which have been great, and thanks. Within the quote from Hal Foster, he's talking about, or he comes to this conclusion about histories and presents. But of course, the question of the contract is about making a claim upon the future. And in terms of the sort of reenactments that have been discussed in a few cases, the question is the kind of implicit contracting that is made in the very nature of a work that must be observed within what it means to think through reenacting it. So that was one thought that I wanted to offer that I was interested in thoughts of. It reminds me of a very good friend who talks about artworks as casting spells, what that kind of a contract form is as well. The other question that's always in my mind in performance conferences, also because I'm trying to work towards it, is an observation that within the field of contemporary art, there seem to be two big realms of questioning, one around performance and another around global art. And it seems to me that they rarely, if ever, come together. That when we talk about performance, we're talking about Judson Church, Warhol Archive, Capra. We rarely address ourselves to global art archives. And I was interested in the thoughts of the panel on that as well.
Yeah, shame on us, we didn't talk about that. You're right. I guess there's quite a lot of research done on, for example, Andre Lepecki has written about the heritage on Elioy Tisika, Lygia Clark, Lygia Pape, and in the art history context, Sabit Buchmann has written about it. But still there is this reference to the 60s context, and either from the practitioners as well as from the art historians or dance scholars or theater scholars. But it's the same with bracketing out some other questions, like, I mean, you addressed in your talk, and we didn't come back to that, also the feminist issues. It's always some parts of it excluded in the discussion. But yeah, just to mention that there is quite a lot, not a lot, but there is this research as well. And really in this also referring to those practices and taking it into account in reconsidering each other from these different perspectives. Working with, just doesn't answer a lot. But,
I'm sorry to do that, but in the Fondation de l'État pièce, Alain Capro and Xavier come after Otisika, Lygia Clark, and Amendieta exhibition. So it's also what we've learned, because for me, Lygia Clark was also, it's interesting what's happening because of the contracts to her work. But that's something else. The other thing is about the Global Art Archive. When Al Foster was quoting, he said a museum for unanimated objects, and I was like, which museum is talking about? You forget completely, like you have, I'm sorry to do that too, in Les Statues Meurent aussi, the film of Chris Marker and Alain René, they say, when the people die, they go to the cemetery. When the objects die, the statues die, they go to a museum. And so this, there is a lot to be, and someone in a museum on anthropology here in Frankfurt did a really, Clémentine Delis, really great job about, and we talked yesterday about different reactivating ritual objects. So to think that the museum are for that object, this is really typical Al Foster. I mean, typical art historian, then this is part of what we were supposed to do. And I do agree that but when you talk about the art and what is to be done to maintain art as art is total ecosystem ecology and economy, that we have to work on the institution themselves, not only on the exhibition side of it, but really on how the structure itself, because if this is not changing, it's true that the academy can do a lot, the media can do a lot, and it's really a problem to, as you say, which critique the newspaper is saying no critique immediately, no? But this is something that is the humus, the ground that we can, you were talking about the contract that we could work on. Sorry?
Thank you very much. I think we really need to close here, but maybe we can continue the discussion downstairs during a short break. How long? 15 minutes break, and then we continue with the next institution to be worked on, the Centre Pompidou, and we will hear Serge Laurent in conversation with Fabian Savidralara. See you in a minute. Thank you very much.